Hello, everyone. This is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. Aristotle starts his Politics with an analysis of the elements of which a state is composed. Before we can determine what is a good or bad state, we must look at what a state is and what purpose it should serve. He will regard the state to be the highest form of community. He says we naturally act to attain what we think is good, and therefore every community that we may form is established with a view to some good. The same will be true of the state. The end product of Aristotle's Politics will not be to declare a particular system to be the ideal state, but rather a conception of what constitutes a good state among more than one type. The failure to definitively declare a utopia may be boring to some people. But what makes Aristotle's Politics important is his conception of how the state is formed and the question of for whose benefit it should govern. My goal here will be to show how Aristotle's thinking leads from what is good for us to what constitutes a good state. The qualifications for being a leader of the various types of human organization, statesman, householder, master, were commonly believed at that time to be the same, only differing in the number of people being ruled. Aristotle believes this is a mistake. It treats the larger household as if it is a state, and ignores the fact that governments may differ in kind. When we look at the various elements that make up a state, we will resolve the compound into simple elements and discover in the process that there are different kinds of rule. So what then are the different elements of the state? How and why do people even bother to form a state? In terms of the original first steps, the first union is of man and woman, without which we would not even be here, formed for the purpose of having the race continue. He does say this, and he does clarify it a little, where he says, "In the first place, there must be a union of those who cannot exist without each other, namely of male and female, that the race may continue. And this is a union which is formed not of deliberate purpose, but because, in common with other animals and with plants, mankind have a natural desire to leave behind them an image of themselves." He adopted the belief common at the time that it is a naturally unequal relationship, with the man being the natural ruler over the woman. Aristotle also put forth an argument regarding slavery to the effect that it cannot be justified as a rule of law or spoil of conquest against an enemy soldier, but is nevertheless justified against persons who, he claims, are naturally fit for being slaves, by virtue of lacking reason or being better fit for physical labor. His argument is not good enough to convince me, but I will follow here the general rule of not demonizing the ancients for not being in accord with the sentiments of our time. The first thing to arise out of the relationships of male and female, master and slave, is the family. This is an association developed naturally to satisfy our everyday needs. When several families become united, the association begins to aim at more than simple needs and constitutes a village. The most natural form of village is the colony from an extended family of children and grandchildren. Aristotle tells us that this is why Hellenic states were originally governed by kings, and barbarians still are. It comes from the tendency for families to be ruled by the eldest. Here we see developing in the text what is often called Aristotle's political naturalism, the idea that the state is an application of desires given to us by nature, and having itself a natural function to serve. It starts with a human desire to associate with others, that is more complex than the same desire in cows, and will eventually be related to a natural human desire for happiness that comes from a life of virtue. The state comes into existence with the formation of several villages, uniting into a single community that is large enough to be at least nearly self-sufficing. It originates in the bare needs of life and continues its existence for the sake of a good life. Since the state is the aim of the original forms, which are natural, the state must also be natural. This is because what the nature of a thing is what it is when it is fully developed. According to Aristotle, the purpose or final cause of a state is to be self-sufficing. It is out of this context, of men naturally forming families, villages, and then a self-sufficing state, that would give man a potential for his full development, that Aristotle gives us one of his famous sayings, that man is by nature a political animal. His meaning is clearly that man is naturally a community builder and a member of it. It does not mean that man is naturally inclined to become a lying politician, either in an electoral system, the media, or a workplace. In terms of further argument for this, he says that man is the only animal with the capacity of speech to express vocally more than just its pleasure or pain. Man has the power to express the expedient and inexpedient, just and unjust, good and evil. It is an association of creatures of the city-state or polis that are in this sense more gregarious than bees, that can make a family and a state. If a man is without a state, but not by mere accident, he is either a bad man or above humanity. Aristotle now goes on to argue that the state is by nature prior to the family and the individual, although not in time. It is the highest form of human association. He says that the whole is prior to the part because without the whole body, there is no severed foot or hand that can function as a foot or hand. In his view, the state must be a creature of nature that has a metaphysical priority over the individual, because the individual in isolation, if self-sufficing, would be either a beast or a god. Man, when he is perfected, is the best of all animals, but becomes the worst when separated from law and justice, which is the bond of men and states. There is a famous question in discussions of metaphysics that is a popular mental exercise known as the ship of Theseus. It asks the question of whether the whole is something more than the sum of the parts. Theseus is a sailor who makes his own repairs to his ship. Eventually, a day comes where every single piece of the ship has been replaced, with no original plank, pole, or anything else, assuming he did not even reuse any nails. We still end up calling it the ship of Theseus, but is it the same ship? If you believe that the whole is something more than the sum of the parts, then you grant it an identity that remains in addition to the same name. If Theseus decides later to let the ship rot on the shore, or a state were to cease to function in terms of how it works or what it is designed to do, then Aristotle will agree that it ceases to be the same thing. Otherwise, while the thing functions, he would apply to the ship or the state his statement that the whole is of necessity prior to the part. Accordingly, a state will continue and preserve its identity when the citizens who founded it are all dead and replaced by their descendants. Now that we see how the state is founded, we are led to the question of what is the ideal form of political community, an ideal state that it may constitute. Aristotle's method involves the study of the many states that existed at that time and their histories, to see what is good or bad about them. His judgment is that all the constitutions with which we are familiar are faulty. As a result, we must look at the natural beginning to examine what might be a good constitution of a political community. Here the term constitution will refer to how a thing is constituted rather than a supreme written law of a state that also binds the government. In some sense, what hatches itself from an egg constitutes a chicken. In terms of giving a definition, Aristotle will specify that the constitution of a state is an arrangement. At two separate points, he calls it an arrangement of the inhabitants of a state and also as the arrangement of magistrates within it. As a state, Athens at that time was what we would call today a direct democracy, where the citizens themselves would gather at the assembly to pass laws. Modern countries that call themselves democracies are instead representative democracies, in which the citizens vote on who to represent them in a legislature that votes on the laws. Either way, it brings up the question of who is a citizen, and thus who can hold those rights. Then and now, simply living in a state does not make one a citizen. Children and foreigners who have not been granted citizenship are generally denied these rights. It was also common then to deny citizenship to women, slaves, and sometimes certain types of laborers. Aristotle makes the argument that allowing a mechanic the right to be a citizen is absurd. In his view, mechanics and other laborers may also lack reason and lack leisure time for thinking and learning to become a good citizen, although there were states accepting them as citizens. The state is a composite of the citizens, and so before examining the nature of the state, we must define the citizen. In his words, the citizen whom we are seeking to define is a citizen in the strictest sense, and his special characteristic is that he shares in the administration of justice and in offices. These terms of office and administrative justice can refer to a broad array of duties that may involve not just regular jobs, but also participation such as serving on juries. Professionally, it can also mean serving as a magistrate or administrative statesman. In many ways, this is similar to the modern Western world, where we may vote, serve on juries or in the military, and be required to be citizens for jobs as judges or policemen, or to run for office ourselves. Now Aristotle seeks to attain some general notion of the virtues of a citizen. There are differences among persons, but the good of the community is the common business of all of them. The virtue of the citizen must then be relative to the constitution of that community of which he is a member. This opens the door to the idea that a good citizen and a good man may not be the same, although in an ideal state they would be. In general, people are not all the same, and so the expectation is that a state would not be composed of nothing but good men. A good citizen is one who knows both how to rule and how to obey. If the virtue of a good man is to be worthy of ruling, and the virtue of a citizen also to obey, they are not equally praiseworthy. Aristotle says there is a kind of rule, a constitutional rule, exercised over freemen and equals, which the ruler must learn by obeying. In obedience, the citizen is effectively in training. We can see it in the military, where a man learns to be a commanding officer by being under the command of one. Likewise, a good citizen will know how to command like a free man and obey like one. These are the virtues of the citizen. In terms of the system of an ideal state, Aristotle's method has him looking at many existing states and seeing that there are different kinds of states. In no case does he see a kind of governance that is not capable of being perverted and corrupt. So instead of declaring a particular system of government alone to constitute a utopia that will solve our problems, he will look to define what makes a good state good, in terms of whether a state serves its proper function. This implies the question of what a good state is to promote in accordance with its proper purpose. As to what shall be the purpose of a state, Aristotle has already determined that men are by nature political animals with a desire to form communities. When brought together, it is for a measure of well-being and the necessities of life. In terms of relationships of ruling, the rule of the master over the slave is for the good of the master. However, the rule of the head of the household over the family is for the good of the governed. When a state is formed by equals on principles of likeness and equality, the citizens think they should take turns holding office. This makes sense because the practitioner of any art receiving the services of another art gains some training in it. When a physician treats a sailor and then subsequently travels on his ship, under each other's care, they learn about each other's art. Without taking turns, some men may always want to be in office in order to retain the advantages of office, or gain from the public reserves. And given this, Aristotle says, the conclusion is evident, that governments which have a regard to the common interest are constituted in accordance with strict principles of justice, and are therefore true forms. But those which regard only the interest of the rulers are all defective and perverted forms, for they are despotic, whereas a state is a community of free men. At chapter 7 of book 3, we come to the point of Aristotle giving us his listing of the forms of government, in both their true and perverted versions. Which form of government is solely a question of the quantity of the rulers? Is it the rule of one, a few, or the many? This gives us 3 forms of government, which, when split into 2 versions of true and corrupt, gives us 6 possibilities. In the 3 true forms, when the state is governed by the common good, we have a monarchy, an aristocracy, and another possibility of what Aristotle termed a constitutional state or polity. This polity he conceives as being a fusion of oligarchy and democracy that turns to the service of the common good. The perversions are called tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. The greater of the 3 that we should prefer could be best described as a kind of polity that has some aristocratic elements to it and a force within to minimize conflict between different factions within the population. Each of these forms of government will have several varieties that Aristotle goes on to describe. For instance, kings or aristocrats can be elected to or inherit their office. The terms of office may be periodical or for life. There may be laws that apply to them, or their power may be diluted by being delegated to magistrates and other officials. Under aristocracy or democracy, there may be requirements to have property. Different circumstances can lead to variations on these broad themes. A tyranny is the rule of the one, for his interests rather than for the common good. An oligarchy will be run for the benefit of the few, who are generally wealthy, while democracy will turn out to be the despotism of the needy. In very small city-states in ancient times, it can happen that the wealthy outnumber the poor, but the general tendency would be to have the wealthy be smaller in number. Aristotle regards each of these systems as having advantages and circumstances under which they can be best suited. In the case of a monarchy, it can be best for a small state, but generally is not the best form of government. It is only where there is a preeminent individual who is more virtuous than the others that he should be king. This will not be applicable to our much larger states today, and Aristotle believed it was not an ideal in his own time. It is fairly obvious how a monarch creates tyranny out of a monarchy. As for the other forms, what can count as an oligarchy or democracy is judged by whether it is the wealthy or the poor who are ruling for their own benefit. It is a question of a conflict between two incompatible conceptions of justice. If we draw a distinction between equality of persons and equality of rights and things, we see the Democrats argue for the equality of persons and seek on that basis equal political rights and things. By contrast, the oligarchs will argue a claim of personal superiority, and on that basis seek unequal rights and things. Aristotle says that both sides are only speaking of a part of justice. Under his conception of a geometric justice of distribution, explained in the Nicomachean Ethics, the man who does better deserves a greater share based on merit, but not necessarily as great a share as what he might claim on the basis of noble birth or excellence. If we imagine the poor using the force of their numbers to rob the rich and distribute the proceeds among themselves, this will clearly be unjust. If the first instance does not ruin the state, further repetitions surely will. But it would also be unjust for a tyrant to rob his citizens, or the rich to soak the poor of what little they may have. It seems then that all forms of monarchy, aristocracy, and polity can be corrupted. So then, should we not have the best man or group of best men ruling? Aristotle argues that it is an honor to hold an office, and that it is not good for the state to dishonor its citizens. In defense of the many poor having a voice, he also makes an argument of the form that two heads are better than one, in that in creating another whole from their discourse that is better than what the sum of the parts would be. He says that the principle that the multitude ought to be supreme rather than the few best is one that is maintained, and, though not free from difficulty, yet seems to contain an element of truth. For the many, of whom each individual is but an ordinary person, when they meet together, may very likely be better than the few good, if regarded not individually, but collectively. He further argues that there is a danger in not allowing the many to share in the offices of the state, because then the state will be full of enemies within. Given these considerations, going on to how to have the best constitution of the state and best life for persons within it under actual circumstances and possibilities, Aristotle turns to his Nicomachean Ethics. According to him, the nature of virtue is to constitute a mean between two extremes. The life which is in a mean must be one that is attainable by everyone in the state. To become a man who follows a rational principle, it is better to possess gifts of fortune only in moderation. In every state we have three classes: the rich, poor, and middle class. He says that the middle class is least likely to shrink from rule, or to be overambitious for it, both of which are injuries to the state. By contrast, those who have too much of the gifts of fortune will not have a capacity to obey, while the very poor are too degraded. we end up with one class that cannot obey and another that would only rule despotically. Instead of a state of masters and slaves, it is better to have a state composed of men who are approximately equal in wealth and status. A strong middle class can serve this function. Otherwise, where some possess very much and others possess very little, out of that conflict arises either an extreme democracy or a pure oligarchy. Nevertheless, Aristotle proclaims that most governments are democratical or oligarchical because he says this middle element is seldom numerous in them. His advice to us is to regard a strong and numerous middle class as what will make the best form of government relative to the given conditions. Any legislator should always include the middle class in his government in order to minimize the conflict between the extreme warring factions. In terms of critical comments that you may or may not agree with, I might as well start with this idea of a ruling middle class. I must agree with him at least that not having a middle class can only be a sign of trouble. But even with that said about them, they can become a contented class that does not care about the poor and can be bought off with a tax cut. Aristotle's arguments for slavery, even if accepted, constitute at best a proof that some people should not be allowed to attain public office. It is sufficient punishment to have them be employees or mechanics instead. I believe history has proven not only this, but also that those mechanics and employees can become good citizens and householders. Either way, such matters can today be demonstrated by IQ tests and behavioral variables, whereas I would guess that in ancient times such judgments were not made on an objective basis. As for restrictions on who should be allowed to vote or serve on juries, we already have requirements for hiring in government jobs, and the same logic can be applied. Instead of having slavery be imposed on someone by heredity or by the judgment of others, which would fall more heavily on the poor and the ugly, we could have testing on IQ and a knowledge requirement for allowing people to participate. Our citizens today do not learn how to govern. A good knowledge requirement can consist in some philosophy, logic, and propaganda recognition. It could be taught in schools through videos and hopefully counteract the tendency many people have to treat newspapers, radio, and TV as oracles out of which nothing but truth could ever emerge. Plato had reasons for believing that the mob is unfit to rule. On the whole, Aristotle has stated in his Ethics that ethics is a branch of politics. But the politics reads as if it was made to fit the ethics, which is proper. It means having a derived rather than a contrived worldview. In ethics, we may argue that nature does not dictate the moral, that an is does not imply an ought, and thus the naturalism seen here does not alone dictate what ought to be done. However, in politics, we should look at other states and history to see what builds and what will only destroy communities, as Aristotle did. This makes sure we do not fight a war against nature. We would lose that war, and there would be people who pay the price. I believe Aristotle's advice is good to insist upon a common good, rather than pursuing a utopian fantasy or favoring a factional interest of the wealthy, foreigners, or rogues. It is also important to heed the idea of us as political animals of the polis, with a connection to others and a culture into which we are born, rather than seeing ourselves as merely workers and consumers, or the not even possible cosmopolitan citizens of the world. Well, that's all for now. If you liked it, check out my other videos, send links to your friends, and thanks for watching.